Hey there, ready to dive into something fascinating.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Today, we're taking a deep dive into the world of cannabis and creativity.
Sounds intriguing.
We'll be exploring this connection using a recent podcast episode as our guide.
Cool. I'm ready to uncover some insights.
Well, get this podcast doesn't just touch upon the connection between cannabis and creativity.
Yeah.
It really digs deep into how these two have been intertwined throughout history.
Wow, okay.
In ways you might not even expect.
I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
It's like we always hear about artists and their creative processes, right?
Right.
But this podcast uncovers this kind of hidden history
Mm-hmm.
of artists using cannabis as a tool
Interesting.
to really fuel their creativity across different cultures and time periods.
Not just a modern thing, then.
Nope, not at all. We're talking way back. It got me thinking, though.
Yeah?
What is it about cannabis that seems to spark that creative flame in people?
It's a good question.
Right. Like, we've all heard the stereotype of the coffee-fueled artist working through the night.
Right. Tons of coffee.
But this podcast really digs into how cannabis, just like coffee or even psychedelics,
Oh, wow.
have been used for generations to unlock that creative potential.
Fascinating.
And get this, there's actually a neurological basis for this connection, too.
Go away.
The podcast talks about studies that have linked cannabis use to increased activity in the prefrontal cortex.
The prefrontal cortex.
That's like at the command center of your brain for abstract thinking and divergent thinking.
Okay, so for those of us who might need a little refresher on brain science,
Of course.
what exactly does divergent thinking mean?
Right.
And how does it actually apply to, say, a musician or a painter?
It's a great question. Imagine a songwriter
Okay, got it.
struggling with writer's block.
Good there.
They have this really simple melody, right?
Yeah.
But they can't, for the life of them, break through to that next verse.
Ugh, the worst feeling.
The podcast actually gives an example of a songwriter in this exact scenario.
Really?
And after using cannabis, they were suddenly able to take that one melody
Wow.
and envision tons of different variations, which ultimately led to a breakthrough in their songwriting. That's divergent thinking in action.
So it's not about cannabis giving you ideas, it's more about
It's about access
access. Yeah,
to those pathways in your brain that might be less obvious.
I like that.
Like, imagine you can see the negative space in a sculpture.
Oh, I see.
Or you hear a melody in a way you hadn't even considered before.
Right.
The podcast actually interviewed a sculptor who said,
Yeah.
after using cannabis,
Yeah.
he started to see the negative spaces in his work
Wow.
with so much more clarity.
Interesting.
It completely changed his artistic style.
Wow. That's wild.
It's a really cool example of how this abstract concept of divergent thinking
Yeah.
can actually manifest in a tangible way
Right.
in an artist's work.
Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of that feeling you get when you're brainstorming, you know,
Oh, yeah, totally.
when all these different ideas are just flowing and you're connecting them in new ways.
Exactly. And the podcast actually highlights how, for some artists, cannabis can enhance that feeling of flow even further.
It makes sense when you think about how cannabis interacts with the prefrontal cortex.
Yeah.
It also plays a role in quieting that inner critic, too.
Ooh, that's a big one.
You know that voice in your head?
Oh, I know it well.
The one that's like, that's a horrible shade of blue, or you'll never be as good as.
Ugh, the worst.
For some artists, cannabis is like hitting the mute button on that voice,
That's amazing.
allowing them to paint or write or compose
Yeah.
freely
Wow.
without that self-judgment holding them back.
It's like giving your inner critic a pair of noise-canceling headphones.
Exactly.
So you can just focus on being creative.
Yes,
But like with anything, moderation is key.
absolutely.
You don't want to become overly reliant on it.
You're right. The podcast emphasizes this point as well.
Okay.
It's all about finding that sweet spot
Right.
where cannabis acts like a tool to enhance creativity,
Yeah.
not a crutch.
Right. To support you, not be a crutch.
And that sweet spot, it's different for everyone.
Of course.
Just
Right.
like everyone's creative process is different.
Totally.
Which actually reminds me,
Yeah.
this podcast is a really cool thing.
It's that.
It dives into how artists across all these different disciplines, musicians, painters, writers, are incorporating cannabis into their work.
Very cool.
Should we explore some of their stories?
Yes. Let's dive in. I think music is a great place to start.
Absolutely. Music and cannabis, they have quite a history together.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, we're talking jazz musicians in the 1920s,
Wow, yeah.
all the way to today's hip-hop and EDM scenes.
Right. It's everywhere.
And what's really cool is that this podcast doesn't just mention names.
Yeah.
It features artists talking about their actual experiences. Oh, wow.
About how cannabis allows them to connect with rhythm, with melody, with lyrics, everything on this whole other level.
I love that. And what I find so fascinating, it's not always about getting high in the traditional sense, right?
Right.
It's about accessing a different level of consciousness, you know?
Yes.
One musician even described it as like a spiritual experience with sound.
Wow.
It's about silencing that inner critic we were talking about earlier. One musician said, and I quote,
Go on.
"When I'm in the studio, sometimes I'll just light up to get in that zone."
Yeah.
It's like it silences that inner critic for a little while, and I can just create without judgment.
Wow.
That really resonated with me.
It's true, though. Lowering those inhibitions, even a little,
Right.
it can be so freeing, especially when you're trying to create something from a truly raw and emotional place.
It's like that feeling of letting go on the dance floor.
Yeah.
But instead of moving your body, you're moving sound, you're moving color, you're moving words.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And you know what I find really interesting, too?
What's that?
For some artists, it's not even really about the feeling itself.
Oh, interesting.
It's about the ritual of it all.
The ritual. Tell me more about that.
Well, for some, it's about setting the mood,
Right.
getting into that creative headspace.
Okay.
It's not necessarily about, being high, but more about the intention behind it.
The intention.
Like, think of a painter, right?
Okay.
Prepping their palette, finding the right music, the right light.
Yeah.
Cannabis just becomes another element of that creative ritual.
Like a mental cue.
Exactly.
A signal to your brain that it's time to create.
Exactly.
That's pretty powerful. It makes you wonder.
What's that?
Could that ritual itself be just as powerful as the cannabis itself?
That's a great question, and it makes you think about the power of our intentions.
It really does.
And how they can really influence our entire experience.
You know, speaking of different artistic experiences,
Yeah.
I'm curious to hear how cannabis affects visual artists.
Me too. That's a whole other level.
Right. We can talk about music, but seeing the world through an artist's eyes is a whole other thing.
Definitely.
Well, get this.
Yeah.
The podcast talks about how cannabis can actually change how visual artists perceive the world.
Wow, really?
And I'm not talking about colors seeming brighter.
Right?
I'm talking about a fundamental shift
Wow.
in how they see and interpret everything around them.
That altered perception of time and space you mentioned earlier,
Yeah.
that must be incredible for visual artists.
Right. Imagine being able to slow down time,
Yeah.
to truly absorb every single detail of a flower,
Right.
of a face,
Yeah.
and then being able to translate that awareness into your art.
Wow.
The podcast highlights how this can lead to some seriously detailed and expressive artwork.
Interesting.
One painter even described it as
Yeah.
being able to see the layers of the world.
The layers.
It's like they're not limited by how things are supposed to look,
I see.
which frees them up to create more abstractly.
That's the beauty of abstract art, isn't it? It allows for a totally different visual language.
Exactly. And it sounds like cannabis can be a key to unlocking that unconventional thinking for some.
Totally. It's like it removes those filters we put on our perception,
Yeah,
allowing for this raw, more intuitive connection to the world around us.
absolutely. But it's not just painting and sculpture either.
Right.
This podcast, it dives into the world of writing too.
Ooh, the written word. That's a powerful one.
Right. Writers, they're always wrestling with this balance
Well, tell me about it.
between structure and imagination.
Yeah.
I'm curious how cannabis plays into that.
Me too. It's a great question. The podcast actually interviews a few different writers
Yeah.
who describe cannabis as a way to bridge that gap
Oh, wow.
between structure and that free-flowing imagination.
I like that.
They talk about how it can help them tap into a more fluid state of creative expression.
Okay.
It can help silence that inner critic.
Right.
Let the words flow more easily.
It's like those moments when you're so engrossed in writing that you lose all track of time.
Exactly.
You're just completely immersed in the flow of ideas.
That's exactly what many of the writers talked about.
Really?
One even said, and I quote, "When I write after smoking, it's like the words just spill out.
Wow.
I'm not constantly second-guessing myself, and I can write faster. I get into the zone easier.
That feeling of being in the zone,
Right.
that's what every artist strives for.
It's that state of effortless creation where time just melts away.
And it's so cool to hear how cannabis can be a tool for some writers to tap into that.
Absolutely. And, the podcast even mentions how it can help break through writer's block.
Oh, wow.
Or even help writers tap into their subconscious.
Oh, wow. That's powerful.
Right.
But we have to remember it's not a magic solution. The podcast makes it clear. Cannabis doesn't automatically make you a creative genius.
Of course not.
In fact,
Yeah.
it can actually hinder some people's creativity.
Right.
So finding what works for you is crucial.
Absolutely. It's all about finding what works for you.
Exactly.
And the podcast even goes on to say that different strains can have completely different effects.
Interesting. So it's not one size fits all.
Not at all. Some people might find that a high CBD strain helps them focus,
Okay.
while others might need a THC-rich strain to feel that extra spark.
Interesting.
It's all about understanding your own unique creative process
Right.
and figuring out how cannabis can play a role.
Or not.
Or
Or not. Exactly.
it's like finding your own personal creative recipe.
Exactly. Like a chef experimenting with different spices.
I love that.
The podcast mentions how some artists really like those energizing strains
Yeah, makes sense.
to help brainstorm and come up with new ideas,
Yeah,
while others prefer those calming strains.
to help them really focus on more detailed work.
That makes sense when you think about it.
Right.
Just like some people need coffee to jumpstart their day,
Totally.
others need chamomile tea to unwind.
Exactly. It's all about knowing yourself. And the podcast had some really helpful advice on this.
Oh, what's that?
They suggest keeping a creativity journal. Every time you use cannabis before you create, jot down the strain, your mood, what kind of creative breakthroughs you might have.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Right. Over time, you might start to notice some patterns emerge.
That's really interesting. I'm always trying to understand my own creative process better.
Me too. And speaking of understanding,
Yes.
this is where the podcast takes a really fascinating turn.
Okay, I'm hooked.
They start talking about cannabis and daydreaming
Oh, wow.
and the subconscious mind.
This is something that's always captivated me.
Right. It's endlessly fascinating.
It really is. What did they say?
Well, the podcast emphasizes how this connection between cannabis and daydreaming could be particularly relevant for certain types of artists,
Oh, okay. Like who?
like writers, filmmakers,
Okay.
really any artist who works with narratives.
Interesting.
They talk about how cannabis can amplify that natural tendency to daydream
Okay.
by reducing inhibitions in a specific part of the brain,
Which part?
the frontal lobes,
Okay.
which are usually responsible for kind of filtering out unconventional thoughts.
So it's like cannabis allows for a freer flow of consciousness.
Exactly.
Wow.
A way to tap into those deeper, more abstract ideas that might not surface in a typical state of mind.
So it's like loosening the reins on your imagination.
Yes.
Exactly.
Wow. And for artists who are working with stories and characters,
Yeah.
that must be incredibly powerful.
Right.
What else did they say?
Well, the podcast shares an anecdote about a writer
Okay.
who describes writing entire chapters.
Wow.
That felt like they came from an external source.
While using cannabis.
Wow.
As if the cannabis allowed them to channel their imagination in a way they never had before.
Wow. That's incredible.
It's like the cannabis helped them quiet down that internal editor.
Oh, right.
One that's always saying, no, that's too weird, or you can't do that.
Yes.
And suddenly they're free to explore all these unconventional, exciting ideas
Right.
without that judgment holding them back.
It reminds me of that feeling you get when you're dreaming, you know?
Yes.
Anything feels possible.
Totally.
You're not bound by logic or self-doubt or anything. It makes you think.
Yeah.
Could cannabis help us access that dreamlike state of creativity
Ooh.
while we're awake?
Right. Like bridging that gap between the conscious and subconscious.
Right. Exactly.
But as we've kind of been saying all along, it's not always sunshine and rainbows.
Right.
The podcast is sure to acknowledge that cannabis isn't a magic cure
Right.
for creative blocks.
Of course not.
In fact, for some, it can actually make those blocks feel even worse.
Really?
Or it can lead to procrastination.
Oh, wow. Procrastination is a big one.
Right. So listening to your own body and your own mind,
Yeah.
it's so crucial.
Absolutely.
Moderation and mindfulness are key.
Right.
You don't want to become overly reliant on cannabis
Yeah.
as a creative crutch.
That's a good point. Instead of just acknowledging that it's not some magical solution, though,
Yeah.
the podcast actually delves into different strategies that artists can use to overcome those creative ruts.
Okay. Like what?
Well, with or without cannabis, it could be as simple as trying a new medium.
Oh, yeah. I love that.
Or even collaborating with other artists.
Collaboration is key.
Or even just taking a break from the work.
Oh, breaks are so important.
Right. To gain a fresh perspective.
Yes, totally.
It's all about finding that balance, isn't it?
Exactly. And one musician even talked about how they only use a small amount of cannabis when they're feeling stuck. It's not about, getting blasted. It's about being strategic, using it as one tool in their creative toolbox.
I like that. I like that a lot.
And you know what? This actually leads perfectly into the last part of the podcast.
Oh, does it? What do they talk about?
They start talking about the future of cannabis and creativity.
Ooh, that's exciting. I'm always curious about how technology and cannabis are intersecting.
It's really fascinating. They talk about virtual reality experiences that are designed to stimulate creativity.
Wow.
Apps that can actually track and enhance your creative process.
Oh, wow. Imagine having data-driven insights into how different strains impact your personal creative flow.
I know. It's amazing. I could totally revolutionize the way artists approach their work.
That's incredible.
They even talk about artists using cannabis with virtual reality to create these totally immersive art experiences.
Get out of town.
Right.
Whoa.
Can you imagine painting in a three-dimensional space?
Wow.
While under the influence of a creativity-boosting strain?
That is next level. It's like literally stepping inside your own imagination.
Right. It's wild.
Yeah.
But I do appreciate that while they talk about the future, the podcast also brings it back to the present.
Oh, that's good. Yeah.
It reminds us that even without the fancy VR setups and cannabis apps,
Right.
there's still so much we can do to cultivate our creativity right here, right now.
Absolutely. Ultimately, our most important tool is within ourselves.
So true.
Our own minds, our own imaginations.
Exactly. And sometimes all it takes is a little shift in perspective.
Totally.
A nudge in the right direction.
Little nudge.
And that could be cannabis.
Yeah.
Or it could be something else entirely.
Absolutely.
Something completely different.
It's about finding what works for you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Whether that's cannabis, meditation, a long walk in nature.
Right.
You just have to find your thing.
Exactly. And speaking of finding your thing, I'm really interested in this whole idea of creative rituals.
Yes.
It's not just about, lighting up and hoping for the best. It's about intention.
It is.
Creating a mindful experience.
Right.
That allows creativity to flourish.
Yes. I was hoping we'd get to this part. It's one of the most practical takeaways from this whole podcast.
Right. It's one thing to dream big.
Right.
It's another to put in the work and take action.
Exactly. And one thing that keeps popping up throughout the whole podcast is the importance of ritual.
Oh, interesting. Tell me more about these rituals.
Well, one artist in the podcast talked about their pre-painting ritual.
Okay.
They light a candle, put on some music,
Okay.
and then prepare their cannabis.
Okay.
It's not really about just like the cannabis itself.
Right.
It's about setting an intention
Okay.
and creating a space where they can really just like fully immerse themselves.
Wow, I love that.
Yeah.
It's like a mental cue.
Exactly.
It's a signal to your brain like, all right,
Yeah.
time to shift gears.
Yes.
It's time to tap into this different side of myself.
Exactly. And for some artists, that ritualistic element is just as important, if not more important, than the cannabis itself.
Wow, really?
Yeah, it's about creating a space where they feel safe to explore, to experiment, to let go of judgment, and just create.
It's about cultivating a mindset
Yes.
of openness and receptivity.
Exactly.
Which is so essential for any kind of creative work.
Yes. Yeah.
And speaking of mindset,
Yeah.
I think it's time we talk about those different cannabis strains.
Yes.
And how they might be tailored to specific creative goals.
And I was hoping we'd get to that.
Oh, yeah, me too. Because that is something I find so fascinating.
Me too.
It's like endless, there's always something to learn.
Right.
So the podcast does a really good job of breaking down some of the more well-known strains and their potential effects on creativity.
Right.
For example,
Yeah.
sativa-dominant strains
Right,
like Jack Herer or Sari Diesel.
Right.
They are very often recommended for boosting mental clarity and sharpness.
Makes sense.
Which makes them great for brainstorming writing or any other creative tasks that require a lot of mental energy.
It makes a lot of sense. Sativas are known for those really uplifting and energizing effects.
Totally.
They can be just the thing to really get those creative juices flowing, especially if you're feeling a little sluggish
Exactly.
or a little uninspired.
Right.
Just give you that little boost you need.
Yeah, a little extra oomph poof.
Exactly.
But then on the other side of the spectrum, you have the indica dominant strains.
Yes.
Like Granddaddy Purple.
Right.
Which are more associated with relaxation, introspection.
Introspection.
Yes, so they might be a better choice for those creative endeavors that require deep focus.
Okay.
Like if you're editing a manuscript
Okay.
or working on a really detailed painting.
Right.
Something where you need to be really in the zone.
Absolutely. It's all about finding the right strain for the task at hand.
It is. And that comes down to trial and error.
Totally. What works for one person might not work for another at all.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to really experiment.
Yeah.
Pay attention to how different strains make you feel.
Right.
Keep a journal.
Yes.
Track your experiences.
Love that.
And don't be afraid to adjust as needed.
Exactly.
If something's not working, you can always switch it up.
Absolutely. It's about becoming a student of your own creative process.
Yes.
Understanding how cannabis can really support you best.
I love that.
The podcast actually shares an anecdote about a writer who discovered that certain strains were hindering their writing.
What?
While other strains were total game changers for them.
Get out.
I know, right? It just goes to show you how nuanced this whole thing is.
It's fascinating.
It is. It really is. It's like cannabis interacts with our individual brain chemistry in such unique ways.
So interesting.
I know what works for one person might not work for another, and that's okay.
Exactly.
That's the beauty of it.
It is about finding your own rhythm.
Yes.
Your own unique formula for unlocking those aha moments.
I love that. And you know, who knows, maybe someday we'll have all these cannabis apps that help us fine-tune our creative process even further.
Right.
It's only a matter of time.
I'm excited for that.
Me too. But you know what? In the meantime,
Yeah.
there's still so much we can learn from artists who are already incorporating cannabis
Yes.
into their creative practice
Yes.
in mindful and intentional ways.
Right. We don't have to wait for the technology to catch up.
Exactly.
We can start experimenting and exploring right now.
Totally.
And this podcast really highlights that.
It does.
It's a great reminder.
And you know, it's important to remember
What's that?
that cannabis isn't a magic bullet.
Right.
It's simply a tool.
Yeah.
And like any tool, it's most effective when it's used thoughtfully and with purpose.
Well said. I love that.
Thank you. It's about respecting the power of this plant
Yeah.
and recognizing that it can be a really valuable companion
Yes.
on that creative journey. But it's not a shortcut to success.
It's not going to do the work for you.
Exactly. It's about doing the work, putting in the effort, and staying curious.
Love that, staying curious.
Yes.
Always important.
Cannabis might help you tap into a different level of consciousness.
Yeah.
But ultimately, it's up to you
Right.
to channel that energy
Yes.
into something truly meaningful
Yes.
and authentic to you.
And that's what it's all about, isn't it?
That's it.
Creating art that reflects our truest selves,
Yes.
our deepest passions,
Yeah.
our unique perspective on the world.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It is. They described it as lighting a candle, putting on some music,
Okay.
and then, like, preparing the cannabis.
Interesting.
It's about creating this sacred space
Yeah.
where they can fully immerse themselves in the creative process.
I love that. It's like a mental cue,
Right, exactly.
a signal to your brain that it's time to shift gears,
Yes.
to tap into the different mode of being.
And for some, that ritual.
It's just as important, if not more important,
Really?
than the cannabis itself.
Wow.
It's about creating that space
Yeah.
where you feel safe
Yeah.
to explore, to experiment, to let go of that judgment.
Yes. Just to create.
Exactly.
It's about cultivating that mindset
Yes.
of openness, of receptivity.
Which is essential for any kind of creative work.
Absolutely. And speaking of which,
Yeah.
I think it's time we talk about those different cannabis strains
Yes.
and how they might actually be tailored to specific creative goals.
I was hoping we'd get to that.
Oh, me too. It's something I find so fascinating.
Me too.
There's always something new to learn.
Right. So the podcast, they break it down,
Okay.
some of the more well-known strains and their effects on creativity.
Okay.
For example, sativa dominant strains, like your Jack Herer,
Okay.
your Sour Diesel.
Yeah.
Those are often recommended for boosting mental clarity
Right.
and sharpness.
Makes sense.
Those can be great for brainstorming, writing.
Anything that requires that mental energy.
They give you that boost.
Exactly. They give you that boost.
That extra little oomph.
But
Yeah.
then you've got your indica dominant strains.
Okay. Like what?
So like your Granddaddy Purple.
Yeah.
Those are more associated with relaxation,
Relaxation. Okay.
introspection.
Right.
So those might be a better choice for those endeavors that require deep focus, like editing a manuscript or working on a really detailed painting.
Wow, okay.
It's all about finding what works for you.
It is, and it really comes down to trial and error.
It does, because what works for one might not work for another.
That's why it's so important to experiment.
Right.
Pay attention to how you feel.
Yeah.
Keep a journal.
Right.
Track those experiences.
Yes.
And if something's not working, you can always switch it up.
Absolutely.
Duh.
It's about becoming a student of your own creative process.
I love that.
Right? Understanding what works for you, how cannabis can best support your journey.
Yeah.
There's actually this writer who discovered certain strains were actually hindering their writing.
What?
What others, total game changers.
Wow. That's so interesting.
Right. Just goes to show.
It's all so nuanced.
It's so nuanced.
And it's fascinating.
It really is. It's like cannabis interacts with our brain.
On such a personal level?
Yes. On this individual level.
Yeah.
What works for one might not work for another.
That's okay.
It's about finding what works for you.
Right. Finding that rhythm.
Your own rhythm.
Yeah.
That unlocks those aha moments.
I love that.
Right. And who knows, maybe someday we'll have all these apps.
Right.
To tell us.
To help us fine-tune it.
Exactly.
That's really exciting.
It is exciting.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, we have each other.
We do.
And we have artists doing incredible work.
Right. We can look to them for inspiration.
Exactly.
There's so much we can learn from them.
Absolutely.
And I think one of the biggest takeaways from this whole podcast
is that reminder.
Yes.
That cannabis, it isn't this magic bullet.
It's not.
It's not going to solve all our problems.
No.
It's one tool.
It's a tool.
And like any tool, it's most effective when used thoughtfully.
Thoughtfully and with intention.
Yes. Well said. It's about respecting the power of this plant.
Yes.
And recognizing it can be so valuable.
Yes, it can.
On this journey.
It can.
But it's not a shortcut to success.
It's not going to do the work for you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about doing the work, putting in the effort, staying curious.
Yes.
Always staying curious.
Cannabis might help you tap into different levels.
Yes.
But ultimately, it's up to you.
Right. It's in our hands.
To channel that energy.
Yes.
Into something meaningful and authentic to you.
And I think that's what it's all about.
Isn't it?
Creating that art.
Yes.
That reflects our true selves.
Yes. Our passions, our perspectives.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah. Well, on that note.
Keep those creative sparks flying.
Yes. And we'll catch you all next time.
See you next time.